To start us off today, here are 6 questions from previous topics. I'm just going to get you to pause the screen on these questions, just write them down in your book and have a go at answering those 6 questions. Take a few minutes to do that, and when you're done, press play and we'll talk through the answers. Okay, so question 1 was to list 3 subcellular structures, they're just structures inside the cell, that are found in plant cells but not in animal cells. And we were looking for the vacuole, where the cell sap's stored, chloroplasts, and the cell wall. Give yourself a tick for each of those you got right. If you didn't get them, just add them in now. Question 2 was, which plant cell structure contains chlorophyll? And this is the chloroplast, or the chloroplasts. Chlorophyll being the chemical inside the chloroplast where photosynthesis takes place. Question 3 was a true or false. The temperature changes as a pure substance melts. That is false. We talked about this in a previous video. Remember, as a pure substance melts, the change in state uses the energy that's added to the molecules. So as they start breaking away from their fixed position and their neat arrangement, that uses up the energy that you're adding by heat, and so the substance doesn't actually change in temperature. Question 4. The melting point of water in degrees C is 0. Question 5. What is the equation for calculating distance? Well, if you know that speed equals distance divided by time, you can rearrange that and you get distance equals speed multiplied by time. And question 6, what does mass mean? Well, mass is simply the amount of a substance measured in kilograms, not quite the same as weight, remember, because weight is the object's mass multiplied by the acceleration that object feels due to gravity, and weight is measured in newtons because it's a force, mass is in kilograms. Today's heading then is neurotransmitter speeds, and there are 2 main areas of this topic that we need to be really sure that we cover and that we understand. The first is synapses. We need to understand the structure of a synapse and the role that synapses play in the nervous system. And the second is what's called a reflex arc. We'll talk about reflex arcs and their role in the nervous system as well. So just pause here, write yourself down the title, and then press play when you're ready. Let's just recap what we've looked at previously with nerve cells or neurons. And we've got a picture there of a neuron. The structure of a neuron we've talked about before. Remember, you have the dendrites on one end of the neuron, and they receive the electrical impulse, and that impulse is passed along the neuron through the cell body and out towards the other end of the neuron where you have the axons, and the axons pass that electrical signal along. So the electrical signal always travels from the dendrites through the neuron to the axon. You can click on the link on the screen now if you want to recap that lesson. What we're looking at there, of course, is just one individual nerve cell. The nervous system is actually made up of millions and millions of neurons, all connected together in what we call a neural network, where lots of different neurons attach to lots of others. So the important thing to remember here is that the axon terminal of one neuron will attach to the dendrite of another neuron, and the electrical signal will be passed along the chain. But where the 2 neurons meet, they don't actually touch each other. There is a tiny gap between them called the synapse, and when the neurotransmitters diffuse or travel across the gap, across the synapse from one neuron to another, they set off an electrical impulse in that neuron. And it's important to understand why the nervous system is built the way that it is, because it would be much quicker if the two neurons were actually touching each other and the electrical signal could travel straight through one neuron to the next neuron. And having a gap there is actually a disadvantage. It slows down the transmission of that signal around the nervous system. However, there are advantages to having a gap. The main advantage I'd like you to remember is that this system allows one neuron to transmit its electrical impulse to many other neurons without losing its signal.
Neurons are a bit like wires. Their function is to transmit electrical signals around the body. But unlike wires, neurons do not physically touch each other. Instead, there's a tiny gap between the ends of the two neurons that meet. This gap is called a synapse, and it's vital to our ability to control and send messages around our body. When you learn about electrical circuits, you learn that the circuit won't work if there's a gap in it. This isn't true of neurons. Signals are sent electrically through the main body of a neuron, but when a signal reaches the end of the neuron and needs to cross the gap to be passed to the next neuron, something different happens.
You'll remember that an axon is the long wire-like part of a neuron that carries messages away from the cell body, and a dendron is the long wire-like part of a neuron that carries messages towards the cell body. Dendrons have branches at the end called dendrites. When the electrical impulse reaches the terminal of the axon, it causes vesicles in the axon to move to the outer edge and release neurotransmitters into the synapse. Different types of neurotransmitter have different effects, but we're going to talk about a neurotransmitter that initiates an electrical impulse in the next neuron.
So the neurotransmitter moves across the synapse and attaches to special receptors on the dendrite of the receiving neuron. When enough receptors have been filled, a threshold is reached and a new electrical signal is generated in the receiving neuron, so the message then moves along. The neurotransmitter detaches from the membrane of the receiving neuron and is reabsorbed into the originating neuron. Once this has taken place, the originating neuron can send a new message.
Receptors on the receiving neuron are specific to a particular neurotransmitter. This is a bit like the lock and key hypothesis for enzymes and their substrates. It's possible to interfere with the process of neurotransmission at a synapse. Some drugs can block specific neurotransmitter receptors so that the signal from the originating neuron is not passed on. In some cases, this can cause death. There are also drugs that can prevent reabsorption of the neurotransmitter into the originating neuron. This means further messages cannot be sent.
So why does the body use this combination of electrical signals and chemical neurotransmitters? Because it has a number of advantages. If the system was solely electrical, the messages would be too fast. There would also be false signals which would trigger other messages. And by using neurotransmitters, the signals have to reach a threshold level before they get passed on. Neurotransmitters also ensure that messages travel in only one direction, whereas in an electrical circuit, electrical signals can travel in either direction.
So we've got on the screen now a past exam question that talks about nerve impulses. It's a 2-mark question, so give yourself a few minutes, just pause the video here, give yourself a few minutes to write that question down and write down your answer. Remember, for a 2-mark question, you're going to need to say 2 relevant things in order to answer that question. And when you press play, we'll talk through the answer. So here is the mark scheme for that question. It's a 2-mark question, and there were 4 possible things. Any 2 of those 4 would actually get you a mark up to a maximum of 2. So you need to talk about the gap between 2 neurons. You need to talk about neurotransmitter, the chemical being released. And you need to talk about the chemical neurotransmitters traveling from one neuron to another. And you might also have mentioned that they stimulate an electrical impulse in that second neuron. So any 2 of those for up to 2 marks. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is what is called the reflex arc. And this is really important because this topic comes up in GCSE exams very, very often indeed. So it's very important that we have a decent understanding of the reflex arc. When you touch a very hot object and you feel pain, what you need to do is to pull your finger away as quickly as possible. The amazing thing about a reflex arc is that in order to save time and allow you to react quicker, it bypasses the need for that signal to travel to your brain and for you to have to think about your reaction and what to do about the fact that your finger is being burnt. The signal simply travels via the receptor and the sensory neuron into your spinal cord, and it comes straight back out again through a motor neuron and is sent to the effector, your muscle, and you pull your hand away without your brain ever having to think about what to do. And the reason the reflex arc does this is to protect us from harm. The fraction of a second that's saved by you not having to actually think about how to react and what to do in that dangerous situation could be enough to stop you from coming to harm.
If you've ever touched something hot and withdrawn your hand immediately without any thought, then you've experienced a reflex action. Reflexes are a way for an organism to react quickly to an external stimulus. By doing so, the organism may live longer or sustain less damage than if it spent time thinking about what to do. Before we look at how reflexes work, it's worth thinking about why they're needed. After all, if the brain is a very powerful control center, shouldn't it be involved in every action of the body?
The answer is to do with time. Reflexes enable a much quicker response, so they reduce the time that the body is at risk. Going back to our example of touching something very hot, even a slight difference in the time that skin is touching a very hot object could mean the difference between a minor burn and irreparable tissue damage. In a reflex action, such as withdrawing your hand from a hot object, the first thing that happens is the receptor cells in the sense organ are stimulated. In this case, receptors in the skin. Then, an electrical signal or impulse is sent along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, a relay neuron connects the sensory neuron directly to a motor neuron. This means that the electrical impulse travels very quickly via the relay and motor neurons to an effector. In this case, the effector is a muscle in the arm which contracts to pull the hand away from the danger.
The impulse from the sensory neuron also continues to the brain where it is processed and you become aware of what has just happened. This is why you sometimes notice a slight delay between carrying out a reflex action and feeling pain. The neurons involved in reflex actions are quite amazing. All neurons are specially adapted cells. Their function is to transmit electrical impulses quickly and without interference. This means that sensory and motor neurons tend to be quite long, like wires, but relay neurons are much shorter.
Unlike the wires in an electric circuit, there are gaps between neurons. These gaps have a scientific name. They're called synapses. When an electrical impulse reaches a synapse, the first neuron releases chemicals into the gap. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters land on specific receptors on the membrane of the next neuron. When enough of them have attached themselves to the membrane, a new electrical impulse is initiated in the second neuron and then travels along it. Synapses are important because they prevent insignificant signals from causing us to respond when we shouldn't.
In a reflex action, the sequence is therefore 1. Receptors detect the stimulus. 2. An electrical impulse travels along the sensory neuron. 3. At the synapse between the sensory neuron and the relay neuron, neurotransmitters move across the gap. 4. A new impulse moves through the relay neuron. 5. At the synapse between the relay neuron and the motor neuron, neurotransmitters move across. 6. A new impulse moves through the motor neuron to the muscle. And 7. The muscle contracts.
The example we've talked about is a hand touching a hot object, but there are many other responses that are also reflexes. For example, your pupils get smaller when you move from a dark room into bright sunshine, and adrenaline is produced when you're scared. We call the organ that brings about the response the effector because it has an effect. Effectors can either be muscles, which respond by contracting, or glands, which respond by secreting a hormone such as adrenaline.
Most neurons have other special features to improve the rapid response. They are covered by a layer of fatty insulation called a myelin sheath. This insulation prevents crosstalk from different neurons, which could result in incorrect impulses being generated. The insulation also allows the electrical impulses to pass along the neuron in little hops, so the signals travel along the neuron faster. The whole process of a reflex action is rapid, automatic, and without thought. It increases the survival chances of the individual.
So here is another 2-mark question. This is from a previous GCSE exam. The reflex arc allows a person to respond rapidly to a stimulus. Explain how a reflex arc produces a rapid response. So this is for 2 marks. So again, try and think about the 2 most important points that you could make about how a reflex arc works and how it protects you from being harmed by some dangerous stimulus. So pause here, write down that question, 2-mark answer, and then press play when you're done. So here is the mark scheme for that question. The 2 points we're looking for is that the brain is not being used, so that's an important point to make because the point of the reflex arc is that it bypasses the brain. And the second point is that it creates an automatic or involuntary response. You can see there that it's acceptable to say that you don't have to think about it. So those 2 points together can give you your 2 marks. So if you got those 2 marks, give yourself 2 ticks. If not, just add in the answer that's on the screen there, so you've got a record of a good answer for that question. Okay, so there's more questions on this topic in the quiz, the forms quiz. I'd like you to head back to Go for Schools, click on the link for that quiz and complete those questions, please. When you complete the quiz, that will get sent to me and I will see the answers that you've submitted. If you can make sure that you do that, because I can track then who's completed the work and who hasn't. If there's any questions at all, please drop me an email and I will do what I can to help you out. Well done for today, and I will speak to you next time.